So I'm Peter, I'm from Australia. I don't know what day it is, but I should be able to get through this. So who am I, and why is just some company you've never heard of up here? I have a background in digital product for a long, long time, kind of doing a mix of everything from development to project management through to strategy. I've also worked at Brightcove since 2015, and then earlier this year I kind of spun out on my own to do some freelance. So I'm consulting and really with a view on delivering strategy for digital product teams. Obviously a big part of that is video still, but also looking at things like metaverse and VR and some of the kind of tangential things that's heading towards. My profile pic is very out of date. I have longer hair and a lot more grey, but my most recent profile was from my COVID lockdown beard, and that's not getting published. But so when I was putting some of this together, one of the key things that I try and do with my consulting offering is really do these kind of targeted investigations into technical solutions, trying to find a specific product fit. So I think helpful to understand what are some of the opportunities, as well as starting to think about where this stuff is going in the future. So I've been looking at, really interested in the way that edge compute has developed and has progressed, and the changes in that architecture. And then wanted to play around with, okay, what can we do with video in that space? So I've got a few things to run through. Wanted to kind of do a bit of a recap of kind of what the architecture changes look like, talk to some use cases, and I think really where the future of this is going. So I have a little screen cap of a demo. This is just really demonstrating the kind of core concept here. I've got a raw playlist that's coming directly off a static service. And then I've got a proxied version, and you can't really see it, but I'll bring up a zoomed in version that is proxying through an edge compute layer. You can also see the horrible gamma reproduction between Apple and these videos being re-encoded multiple times, and then big screens, but I'm not here as the video producer. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture, right? This is the kind of classic web architecture, or video architecture. You have your video storage, even in the general web space, it's your CMS. You have a packaging layer, which might correspond to your APIs. We have our caching, we have our players. The key thing that kind of edge compute is adding is this layer of ability to do compute out at the cache edge rather than back at the packaging layer. But one of the things I want to think about this is as kind of a remix layer. It's the ability to kind of grab and mix different things together. Pseudo-code, don't bother reading it. This was like my very basic POC thing, but the point is it's very lightweight. It's kind of easy to put some of these things together. And really the kind of core steps is that from the compute layer, you're making a request from whatever your backend happens to be, running it through whatever kind of filtering, mixing that you want to be doing, and then returning that response down to the end user. But I think this obviously starts to lend itself to some interesting things, right? You can do all sorts of different types of filtering. You can actually mix and match different types of requests. There's also nothing kind of stopping me using a backend that is any other service. It's not necessarily one I control myself. And then, of course, being able to do things like put headers on the front and do layers of auth and that sort of thing. At the edge compute potentially just makes it easier to kind of distribute out to different devices that require different types of setups. So really my filtering is just doing some really basic manifest manipulation. I chose HLS because it's just really easy to loop through a text file in order. But looking for particular types of formats and doing some rewrites. All I'm really doing for the kind of basic line here is sticking my edge compute URLs in front of the piece, and then figuring out, okay, if I'm requesting a segment, I want to redirect to the segment. If I'm requesting a child manifest, I need to do a little bit more with it. So manifests kind of go from this very basic static thing to something with a redirect on it. Obviously, you can do more here with things like auth and additional filtering. The key part, right, is that the edge is just really knowing, am I redirecting, am I rewriting? What I don't want to be doing here with the segments is actually pulling segments as well through the edge compute, because you're just adding a lot of file transfer to machines that really aren't built for it. But so the basic demo, right, is I've got that same video that I showed earlier, but I want to be able to stick a little bumper in front of it, and maybe then we get a branding request and we want to change the bumpers out, and I can kind of dynamically just swap it out for same thing with different colors. So I'm doing a very basic, literally just inserting an extra segment in the front of the manifest. I cheated for the sake of an experiment, and I just literally made a bumper that is 2 seconds long. But obviously there's more you could do in terms of kind of loading bumpers from different sources. I guess the key here is where we're starting to mix video content from different places. This could be driven by other manifests, by hints, by backend rules. So my manifest just ends up with this extra segment in front of it with a discontinuity to make the players happy. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what the thinking around some of remixing comes from. You know, it obviously goes back in a lot of art forms, in things like collage, in things like blackout poetry, you know, this idea of kind of working with existing content and mixing it up in different ways, or like Ballard's experiments with cut and paste text art, where he's kind of creating whole new experiences, whole new content out of existing things. Obviously, it's big in music. I guess one of the other things this story tells, right, is that it's becoming increasingly digital and more accessible. And I think that's where it's going to happen to video, of course, as well. This is how I learned to cut film, mostly because my university had very old material, not because I'm that old. But it's, you know, I think that the progression we see in terms of the simplification of tools, the more accessible they are to different users. And this is kind of playing in parallel with different web architecture trends, right? There's always been this kind of historical tension between, do you do your compute on the server, do you do it on the client? You know, we suddenly got mobile phones on the internet, and people had to do all sorts of extra compute on the back ends to make things simpler. And then as phones got more and more powerful, we shifted a lot more compute to the front. But I think so. This kind of swings back and forth. But I think this notion of kind of compute being everywhere is really going to require a different architecture. And here, you know, for now, edge compute is something that kind of sits alongside a cache. But I think there's this future trend where it's going to become an edge is just as much the mobile phone, a mesh network of things that are in this room, a cell tower base station, as well as kind of adding, you know, 5G coverage, bringing on whole new regions of the planet, you know, right up to kind of the latest in terms of how people access the internet. And from there, it's reaches to Antarctica, it's out to space. So I think edge compute kind of as a concept is this kind of balancing opportunity to change the way we think about how we architect applications and how we can put video together. It has all the benefits of kind of centralized app development and management, but with a distribution. In parallel, there's kind of this move in general web technology around kind of thinking about development and putting pages together and putting content design together in blocks of content rather than in kind of building a whole page. And so a content design kind of built from this idea of, okay, what's the discrete piece of content? What is the different ways that it might appear? And I think this idea of blocks in web tech are an interesting one. You know, you might be familiar with some of these if you've used WordPress or Notion, or these ideas of kind of just dropping in a block, and with some of these there being an underlying data format that you can swap out so you can change the presentation. And just as kind of a reference for where this is going, I think the challenge in scaling this is figuring out how we actually kind of define structure around blocks. I think there's work being done in that space. But one of the key things, right, is that it shifts the power in terms of constructing content, putting it together from developers and into the hands of kind of more regular users. And I think we're going to see similar things happen in video. I think AI is accelerating all these trends, right? The fact that we're already seeing things like AI-based video generation and not just image generation is going to make a lot of the kind of construction of content more accessible. And I think we'll see it in not just kind of creating new content, but remixing existing content. So kind of automatically being able to cut up videos, identify kind of discrete scenes, and it'll give people the tools to mix video up in different ways. So some key use cases kind of in that video mixing space, right? The way this mechanism works is it's a basic kind of manipulation request. I'm asking the server, the serverless server, get me a video X. I want to make a particular manipulation. I might have some inputs to go with that. You can do things like layer that into a JWT and have some kind of additional validation so that you're not just giving end users the freedom to do whatever they want. But so there are some core kind of types of manipulations you can do here, and some of these are things that you can do right now and I think bring a lot of utility just for some simple video solutions. So think about, for example, manifest filtering, where you might want to be filtering out codecs or different sizes, bit rates, whether it's based on rules like not delivering certain bit rates to certain parts of the world, or it's kind of cutting out certain codecs to certain devices. Not everybody has Disney streaming money, and I think being able to play with this on an edge compute is pretty powerful for the rest of us. Using it for things like bumpers, promos, content warnings. I wouldn't necessarily go all the way to build an SSAI service on edge compute right yet, because there's a lot of kind of additional session management and tracking that you need to do. But for kind of those basic things where you just want to be able to drop some pre-built content in front of other materials, it can be very simple. I think there's some use cases around things like trimming VOD, trimming live, doing things like serving a start over playlist for live that kind of just cuts back to a defined time so that people can scrub back to the start of an event. And even dynamic CDN switching, I think there's use cases here, particularly once you are doing things like intercepting all of the segment requests, you can then start to make choices around redirecting to different locations. But personalization is kind of a key thing too, right? As soon as we're not having to pre-produce all these variations, there's a bit more opportunity for dicing and slicing things, in particular for different types of users. So this is just an example. I've taken the video from before that was a minute long, and it was just looking at the water and just kind of recutting it to trim some different subsections out of it. And then a variety that is just generating some captions. So I don't know if you can make it out, but there's a little hello world in here. And then I can switch to a personalized version. So again, this is the idea of passing an additional parameter through. And if it loads successfully, it should say hello Demuxed. And again, pseudocode is very straightforward here in terms of kind of swapping material into the captions. But the other thing this also demonstrates is this ability to just generate files that don't even necessarily exist on an origin. So this could be loading a caption file from somewhere else and rewriting it, but it can also just generate an entirely virtual file. So getting into the remix model, I think we can start to do a little bit more than just a manipulation that's done on the edge, because it is possible to make these additional API calls to different origins. So the idea here of the kind of the basic architecture is asking for a video with a particular manipulation. The edge kind of goes back through the cache, back to the origin, figures out how to manipulate it, it passes it down. But if we talk about something like a variation, this could be a pre-built playlist that you've put on your server, and you say, okay, I want a cut of this video for a particular type of audience. That gets passed through as a parameter. It makes an extra origin request to go, okay, what's the particular edit list that I want to put together, manipulates the video and passes it down. So these then don't have to be pre-built videos and entirely pre-packaged, but some pre-built lists. In the long form world, right, this is already normal enough to have multiple edits of a long form film, right? The director's cuts, explicit versions, broadcast versions, things where you have kind of censored or clean cuts for different markets. But I think it's worth thinking about how short form content can behave in similar ways. So rather than thinking about kind of producing a whole news bulletin or a 1 hour course or that sort of thing, thinking about kind of dividing that video up into blocks of content, particular theme elements. And it could be things like the news, where somebody gets a personalized, okay, these are your highlights of what's happened today. But through to things like using generated video for onboarding somebody onto a product, where it's tailored to the type of offering that they've taken up. So even a bank, for example, that might onboard a new customer, able to then just deliver a version of the video that is tailored to the 3 products that they've purchased. And so being able to put a layer of personalization on top of that, some of that can just be that basic segmentation of, okay, we drop people into particular groups and we've predefined some groups, but I think there'll be kind of scenarios that fall out of this where doing more dynamic personalization gets pretty straightforward. So there's a handful of limits with what I've been playing with so far. I cheated a little bit. I'm only cutting on segments. I think there's scenarios. I was chatting to Will Law, who insists that Dash could help because we can define these sub-second segments. Obviously, there's a lot of pain around what players are going to support. I think there's other scenarios with kind of getting away from discontinuities and cutting on segments where you might have scenarios where you actually want to do a little extra work on the server to kind of pre-prepare, pre-condition, or kind of adding keyframes, those sorts of things. For these exercises, I've just taken the very lazy linear approach to manipulation. It just runs through a text file in order, but the kind of extended version of this would kind of build out a model, recreate the manifest in different ways, and that way you can really get into kind of different edit styles. I also experimented with getting a little bit more creative personalization of the captions, but most players just put the captions where they want to put them, which is a little bit of a limit. Key thing that I think edge compute needs to kind of really build on some of these capabilities, storage options. There's some room to kind of track application state. A lot of these things have kind of a local dictionary that you can store, but obviously that's not going to track huge volumes of content. There's no real way to kind of scale that per user state without going back to an origin. You can obviously do a little bit with some cookies and with some JWT, but then you start getting dependent on players again as well. The way some of these are architected, I think there's opportunity, right, for an edge compute to be writing into a local session storage, so you can at least have some session management that doesn't necessarily have to become persistent. But I think persistent storage is coming, and I've seen advances like things like SQLite in WebAssembly, WebAssembly libraries that PlanetScale have for making calls to their database just using basic HTTP requests. So I think being able to kind of just add some of these extra origin requests will really kind of extend what we can do with this layer. Actual video processing, not really there yet. It could be a lightweight service. It could be something that the edge compute layer kind of asks for some additional things. Imagine being able to do things like some dynamic rendering, some overlays on top of video, doing watermarking or fingerprinting at the edge instead of having to pre-prepare a lot of it. And getting into some of those things like being able to do sub-segment cuts. But a couple of key things then, what do we think about it? It's a really flexible architecture, a really flexible tool, but it is very resource constrained. Something that's expensive to do like full computation in, but it's very cheap for manipulation. All the demos I put together all kind of ran through very, very quickly. I think as soon as you start building a model of things and having to make multiple requests, you add a lot of latency to that edge compute layer that's not necessarily built for that yet. So really, it's a numbers game. It's going to work really well for content that is already well cached because it's able to kind of just skip a lot of extra calls to origin. But it's going to struggle with things that are rarely requested. So I think if you wanted to start picking this up today, I'd be saying start with your APIs, mixing some fragments of content, maybe start with some of those basic manifest use cases like the filtering. But think about designing for this in a product. Produce content for short snippets and be building this into a production schedule where it's part of your storyboarding all the way through to editing. So video content block in that sense, it could be a scene, it could be a story within a larger bulletin. It could even be individual cutaways. I don't think we're at the point where it makes sense to kind of mark up every cut, but that data exists in a lot of places, and I think being able to kind of extend on that and build through it will always be helpful. So being able to store that metadata alongside the fragments, even things like interest and topic markers and that I think will help as well. It's really scrappy, but I think there's use cases where fast and scrappy is really powerful. And I think the tech is going to catch up very, very quickly as well. So I think it is worth, as engineers, as product teams, kind of being prepared for these changes, for the architecture that's coming, and for the content that you're producing for it. Thanks.